Okay, I have finished all of my rows in seed stitch, and now it's time to bind off. And the bind off that I like to use for the top of these market bags is a bit of a stretchy bind off. It's a little bit stretchier than just binding off in pattern, which is good because this cotton yarn is not always very stretchy or giving all by itself, so having a little bit of a stretchy bind off is going to help. But anyway, basically what we're going to do is knit the knit stitches and purl the purl stitches. It's the yarn overs in between that are going to give it its stretch. So we're going to knit this first stitch. Then of course for a purl stitch you would bring your yarn to the front of your work. We're going to do that, but we're also going to wrap it around the needle and then bring it back to the front for a yarn over, and then purl that stitch. And now we're going to pass that yarn over that purl stitch, and we're also going to pass the knit stitch over the purl stitch. And I'm sorry, this is so hard to do where the camera can see what I'm doing and I can see what I'm doing. Okay, it gets a little easier. Okay, and now the next stitch that we're going to have is a knit stitch. So instead of you doing your usual yarn over, coming from under the needle and going over like so, we're going to come from behind and go over the top of the needle and then back around to the back and then knit. And you're going to pass both stitches over the last stitch. And I normally don't I'm not generally so clumsy doing this, but I'm having to hold my work a good distance away from me so that it's on camera, so it makes it a little bit more difficult. So there we go. So now we have bound off 3 stitches, and I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this before. We're going to be binding off 13 stitches. And then we're going to be slipping the 8 stitches that were in between the 2 markers. We're going to bind off the 8 stitches that were directly in between those 2 stitch markers. So we're going to bind off 13, slip 8 stitches onto a double pointed needle, and then bind off 13 more. And that's why I like to leave the markers in all the way up, because if I get a little lost in my count, all I have to do is count 13 back this way and then 8 more, and I can see how many more stitches I have left to bind off if I lose count. So those stitch markers really help. Otherwise I would be completely lost. If I lost count, it would be so difficult to figure out where I am in the stitch count. So I think I've bound 2 off, so I still have 11 to go. So I'm going to continue binding off in pattern with the yarn overs. So see here we have a purl stitch, so we're going to come under the needle, go over it, and come back around to the front, purl, pass the stitches over, and now we've bound off 3. So next stitch is a knit stitch. We're going to come over the top of the needle, go around back to the back, knit, and then pass both stitches over the last. Okay, I'm to the last bind off stitch before it's time to switch stitches to double pointed needles. So again, this is a purl stitch, so I'm going to bring the yarn to the front, over the needle, and back to the front, purl that stitch, and now pass these 2 stitches over the first. Okay, now I'm going to take a double pointed needle. I'm going to take this stitch that's on the needle, and I'm going to go ahead and slip it onto a double pointed needle and take my circular needle out. And I'm going to knit, since this is the first of 8 stitches, I'm going to knit 7 stitches. I'm going to actually purl and knit 7 more stitches. So I've got 1 on the needle. So since this was a knit stitch, to stay in pattern, I'm going to purl it to keep in the seed stitch pattern. So I'm going to purl, then knit, then purl, then knit, then purl, then knit. 2, 4, 6, 7. 1 more, a purl. Oh, I'm so sorry if you couldn't see that. Okay, now we've got 8 stitches on the double pointed needle, and so we're going to bind off the next stitch. So since it's a purl stitch, we're going to bring our yarn to the front, go over and around the right hand needle and come back to the front, purl. Okay, so I'm going to pass over just the yarn over stitch, like so. And now what I'm going to do is pick my circular needle back up, and I'm going to slip that stitch onto my circular needle, and I'm just going to leave my double pointed needle with those stitches, just pulling it to the front of the work. It's going to be in the way for just a little bit, but it's not that bad. Okay. Now we're going to come over the top of the needle with the yarn and back around to the back, knit that stitch, and then pass both of them over. I know that double pointed needle is making it very difficult to see, and my angle doesn't help much either. I apologize. This is a lot harder to film than I realized. Okay, so you're just going to continue in that fashion. When you get to your stitch marker, you're going to take it off, bind off 13 stitches, then do 8 stitches in a seed stitch on another double pointed needle, then continue to bind off to the next stitch marker, remove it, bind off 13 stitches, then place 8 or knit 8 stitches onto a double pointed needle, and continue until you come back around to where we started binding off. Okay, at this point you should have 4 double pointed needles with stitches, live stitches on them. So you should be able to spot the beginning of your round, because you're going to be able to see where you picked up, you know, where you started and finished with colors. So you'll be able to see that seam, so to speak, in your work, and that's going to be one side of your bag. So that means these 2 needles are going to make one handle, because we want this. Let me start again. If we had this seam here and we joined these 2 sides together, then this would either be the front or the back of our bag, and I just personally prefer that on the side. So we're going to join these two sets of live stitches together to make one handle, and then these two sets of stitches together to make one handle. So to do that, there it is. I've got my 5th double pointed needle that came with this set, and what we have to do now is join our working yarn back to the project. So I just made a loop with it and left a tail. And I'm going to go in this stitch as if to knit, and with the tail away from me on this side, I'm going to loop that onto that double pointed needle and pull it through. And now we've attached our blue yarn again. Now don't worry about that end. We are going to take care of that when we go to weave in all of our ends. We'll just weave that in and secure it so it won't come loose. And it will, believe me, these handles will be strong enough to handle the groceries that you put in them. So we're going to continue in, since we did this seed stitch around the edge of the purse, and because it is so good for keeping the fabric from curling, we're going to use the seed stitch to make the handles as well. So we have, it's going to be 8 stitches wide, and it's going to be 100 rows long, and we're just going to knit it in seed stitch, which I was about to do wrong. Let me go ahead and pull that out. Okay, since we knitted that first stitch, then we're going to bring our yarn forward. I'm going to go ahead and get set up. I'm a continental knitter, and I'm doing this a little strange for me, so I need to go ahead and get set up. Okay, so now we're going to purl this stitch and knit this stitch and purl, knit, purl, knit, and purl. Okay, I'm just going to give that a little tug and pull it tight. Oh, what on earth did I do here? That didn't quite purl. Okay, and purl that stitch, and that one's kind of loosey-goosey. Okay, and then you simply turn the work and you go back the other direction. So from this side, this is a knit stitch, so we're going to purl it. Then knit, then purl, then knit, then purl, knit, purl, and knit. Back to this side. Now this is completely optional. You should at this point have enough of your color A yarn to complete both handles, but also have enough of color B yarn to incorporate it into the handles. So whether or not you do that is entirely up to you. I just like the look. Since we did have the striping in the bag, I just think the striping in the handles is really cute too. So I'm gonna go ahead and attach color B. And then our next stitch is going to be a purl. And then a knit, and then a purl. And we're just continuing in that seed stitch. So that we don't have a curly fabric. Okay, now I like to come back, see how everything got kind of loosey-goosey over here. I'm just going to come over here and give everything a little tug and tighten it back up. Now you could, if you're so inclined, go ahead and tie these two tails together, but it really isn't necessary, because when we weave them in, when we weave them in, we are going to secure them and they're going to be just fine. We just want to make sure everything's snug. Okay, and as before, you're going to turn your work. Now if you're somebody that can knit backwards, please feel free to do that. That is not a skill set that I own. I'm somebody that has to turn my work. So again, the first stitch on the back side is going to be a purl. And a knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, and knit. And now we've got 2 rows in each color, and that's the pattern we're going to continue with. So now we're going to go back to working with, we're going to do 2 rows in color A. So it's going to be a knit stitch, so you can see this is kind of towards the front of the work, and this is also going to help secure this tail here. I'm just going to bring it to the back over that working yarn and get myself set up to knit. And you see I'm just holding it with these 2 fingers. Another thing you could do, and it might be a little easier for you, is to do one handle in one color and one handle in the other color, but be creative and do whatever makes you happy with it. Whenever you look at it, you think, oh, that is so beautiful. Whatever makes you feel that way, do that. Okay, and turn your work. Set up to purl the first stitch. That's where the first few rows are the absolute hardest. After that, you just start cruising along. So we're going to purl. And knit. Okay, and turn back to the front of the work. And I always like to give the two working yarns a bit of a twist at the ends, just to keep the ends looking neat and to keep there from being loopy gaps on the sides. Okay, you can see the striping that's starting to happen, and this also helps you keep track of keep your count, because you know that every color stripe equals 2 rows. So you know you started with 2 rows of blue, so it'd be 2, 4, 6, 8, and you can use a row counter if that's a little bit easier for you, but this will make it really simple to keep track of where you are and know when you get to 100. So once we reach 100 stitches, or 100 rows rather, I'll be back. Alright, I've knitted 100 rows, and now it's time to connect the 2 ends of this first handle. So I'm going to go ahead and clip off both yarns, but I'm going to clip off a little extra of color A, or my blue yarn, because I'm going to use that to graft the seams together. And I'm going to use a tapestry needle. I'm going to go ahead and thread my yarn onto that, and I'm going to use the Kitchener stitch to sew this seam together, and I'm just going to run it up through this stitch, because you see where it left off here on the last row of blue that I knitted. So I'm going to just bring it up closer to where I need it. Okay, and the first thing we need to do for the Kitchener stitch is do our setup. So you're going to take your needle, go in this first stitch as if you were purling a stitch, and just pull it through, and then go in the back stitch as if you were going to knit it, and just pull it through. And now you're set up to complete your Kitchener stitch. So now the way the Kitchener stitch works, we're going to go in this first stitch as if to knit and pull it off the needle, and then go in the next stitch as if to purl and leave it on the needle and pull it tight. And on the back, we're going to go in that stitch as if to purl and pull it off the needle, and go in the next stitch as if to knit and leave it on the needle. Okay, and to show you that setup again, or the stitch again, go in the first or the front stitch as if to knit and pull it off the needle, and then go in the next stitch as if to purl and leave it on. Go in the back stitch as if to purl and pull it off the needle, go in the next stitch as if to knit and leave it on. Pull it tight. So the little rhyme is knit off, purl on, purl off, knit on. Okay, when you get to the last 2 stitches, you're just going to be knitting and purling them off of the needle. So we're going to knit off and then purl off and pull tight. And now you're ready to weave in this end, and since it's already connected to the needle, we're going to go ahead and do that. And I go over to weave in the ends, and just to secure this seam a little bit better, I go ahead and weave in to further join that seam. So I'll go in color B and then through color A and then back. And I don't normally weave in, you know, for this long an area, but because we're joining a handle seam, I like to go ahead and give it a little extra strength. Okay, now this is a tip I picked up from Stacy at Very Pink Knits when securing a 4-stranded thread like this, or yarn that's fairly strong, which this cotton is. Go ahead and separate into 2 pieces, 2 strands each, and then take one of those strands and thread it back, or one of those pieces and thread it back onto the needle. And this stitch that I just came out, or just came through, I'm gonna go back through it with just one of those strands, hopefully. And now I tie a nice neat little knot, and you can pull it fairly tight. Don't pull too tight, you don't want to break the yarn. And now that seam is very secure, and go ahead and trim it off. And I'm going to do the same thing with this end and tie it together. And just tie it in a nice tidy little knot. And that is what I'm going to do with all of my ends that need to be woven in every spot. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to weave it in for a few stitches and then separate it into 2 strands, run 1 strand back through the last stitch I just wove it through and tied it in a knot. And I'm going to do that throughout the entire bag to secure all of the ends. Anyway, that's how we make a handle and attach it to the bag. It is going to be nice and sturdy and strong, and the fact that you're going to have 2 handles is going to give it even more strength if you've got it loaded down with groceries. Well, I finished the second handle, and I had just enough, barely enough, of the coral yarn left to do that. This is quite literally how much was left. But as I said in the beginning of this series, that was my whole idea behind this pattern in this bag, and I really thought I had it to where I wouldn't even have this much of the blue left, and this is how much of the blue yarn is left. And I think I probably could have added a couple more rows in here and I would have had not that much of it left. So feel free to adjust the pattern and add a couple of rows here. And if you're like me and you just really don't like a whole bunch of leftover yarn, you don't have to have even this much left over, which is not much. I mean, you see that's the palm of my hand, so it's not that bad. But anyway, so this is what it looks like finished. I've had some people tell me that it looks like a giant upside down beanie, and I suppose it does, because that is where the inspiration for this bottom came from, was Fair Isle hats and other sorts of hats that are knit in this fashion from the top down. I just really like that because I like that I didn't have a hole to have to close up in the end. I like that I didn't have a lot of seaming to do around the bottom of the bag. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on how to knit this market bag. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments section below, or feel free to email me at janinecrafts@gmail.com. And as always, thank you so much for tuning in and watching, and please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. Thanks.